Good evening and welcome to the Adam Smith Institute. My name is Matthew Kilcoyne and I'm the Deputy Director here. Tonight I am pleased to be joined by Alex Tabarrok, the Bartley J. Madden Chair in Economics at the Mercator Center and a Professor of Economics at George Mason University. Along with Tyler Cowan, he's the co-author of the popular economics blog Marginal Revolution and co-founder of Marginal Revolution University. I'm also joined by Sam Bowman, the Director of Competition Policy at the International Center for Law and Economics, where he's also a senior fellow here at the Adam Smith Institute and was once my boss. But I will not be trying to do too much deference today, but trying to explore some of the more undiscussed elements of the economics that have surrounded the COVID crisis, pandemic, and financial, fiscal, monetary responses by governments right around the world. One of the major ones that has crept up again and again is the level to which the interventions by government in everyday life, in whether shops and bars and pubs, and the way in which you are able to see friends and family are regulated and controlled, and whether this is a proportionate and measured response. Sam Bowman recently wrote a piece, a scathing piece of various actions by Western governments, especially here in the United Kingdom, entitled "The War We Never Thought." And I thought I'd go to him first to ask him about whether he really thought that the externalities of the costs of lockdowns, of the various parts of the economy that have been shut down, were worth the saved lives or the postponement of various people being ill from this particular disease, and whether this is something that we can maintain over the next few months. Sam, over to you.
Hello, thanks Matt. Thanks everybody for tuning in and joining us. What I want to do is talk less about the kind of pros and cons of lockdown, because I feel like we've sort of been there before, and talk more about the things that we could have done that we didn't do to avoid a second lockdown, or at least to delay it. Because there's this kind of sense of inevitability to all of this. There's this idea that I think a lot of people have that, it's winter, a spike was unavoidable. So really the only debate is, do we want to lock down and try to save lives, potentially at the cost of the economy, or do we want to let the virus rip, let it kill hundreds of thousands of people and, think that might give us some economic benefits if we do that. But I think that's a little fatalistic and lets the government and lets some people off the hook in ways that probably aren't smart. And if we don't learn the lessons from what we did that contributed to this second spike, I think it's pretty likely that we'll be looking at a third lockdown in a few months' time. So just remember that over the summer, the government pretty much acted as if it thought that COVID was done with. That's the most charitable way of explaining a series of very significant decisions it made. The first one, the big one was, the kind of headline one was Eat Out to Help Out. A paper just came out this week that purported to show that Eat Out to Help Out did lead to a fairly significant contribution to the kind of rise in cases in August. But I think there were much more important contributing factors. Another kind of slightly trivial one was this government go back to work or you're fired campaign that the government sort of floated in the press and then withdrew. But the really big ones were things like, reopening universities, requiring in-person teaching at universities. And I hope that we can discuss that a little bit more, because I think it's really significant that the government is not now closing universities. Reopening schools, and I know there's some debate about whether, I know many people think that it's important to send kids to primary school no matter what, even if that does mean a second lockdown and so on. I disagree, but I think we could all agree that secondary schools being reopened was a colossal mistake. Foreign holidays being allowed on a mass scale, I think, was a huge mistake. And there's really strong evidence now that a lot of the cases that we had and all of Europe had came from Spain originally and from holidaymakers coming back. And to compound all of this, the government wound down furlough and other supports for businesses, which led to a lot of businesses laying off staff. And now furlough is coming back. So a lot of businesses that would have been able to furlough their staff, had they known that furlough would come back, ended up laying them off in the first place, which defeats the whole point of furloughing. So those were things that the government did do, but I think it's just as interesting to think about what we didn't do. Everybody talks about the lack of a test and trace system, but to be fair to the UK, we're not alone in that. Very few countries in the West, at least, have developed a test and trace system, and that's very depressing and says very gloomy things, I think, about our ability to do grand projects rapidly. But there are loads of other kind of small, more creative things that we could have done to reduce the R0, the rate of spread of COVID, and maybe even keep it to a level where we could have avoided a second lockdown altogether and kind of made us COVID proof for the winter. But that would have meant accepting that it wasn't back to normal, that the disease was still with us, that we were going to have to live very uncomfortable lives for some amount of time. But that could have meant things like a genuine shift to outdoor drinking and dining. One thing I think should have been the default and should remain the default after the second lockdown ends is any pub or bar that has a parking space or a second lane of road outside just owns that parking space or second lane of road until the crisis is over. They can use it for dining, they can use it for people drinking out there, they can do whatever they want. Similarly, I would have given grants for businesses moving outside, grants to companies improving ventilation inside in places where people really had to go into, like shops and things like that. It's astonishing that the major public health campaign still in the UK that we've had so far has been about hand washing, when we know that hand washing is not now the number one way to prevent the spread of COVID or to prevent yourself from getting it. It's to do with aerosol spread and respiratory droplets. And I think very few people actually realize that. And that might be one reason that mask wearing is incredibly low in the UK. And every time I've been on the tube, every single carriage has had a few people not wearing masks or wearing masks below their nose or pulling down their masks to talk to their friends, because of course it's really important that your friend hears what you have to say. I think we could have been a lot stricter about foreign travelers. This is slightly more complicated because the UK has a huge amount of reliance on overseas trade, food and things like that going in and out every day. But we didn't even bother quarantining people coming in through Heathrow. You just sign a declaration and walk straight through. There's absolutely no enforcement of that. I think we could have considered, as Australia did, custodial quarantining, where if you want to come into the country, you have to spend a week at your expense in a hotel. Luckily, a lot of hotels are open now, so are empty now, so we probably could have done that. When it comes to schools, I know this is a really long list, but I think the point is to just be, as creative as possible. When it comes to schools, I don't know why we didn't go ahead with or investigate the idea of teaching pods, where, instead of having classrooms of 25 people, we have mini classrooms of, say, 5 people. I'm sure that isn't as good as being in a classroom with 25 people, but it's better than having to shut down the entire class when a single person's family member comes down with COVID. And in terms of money and in terms of spending, I think we really should have had, and I think we should have, perma furlough until the crisis is over. I think we should probably increase statutory sick pay so that people who do feel the need to self-isolate don't feel that they're going to be losing out on a huge amount of money if they do. And I would probably increase unemployment benefits as well, because a lot of people have now fallen through the cracks. Obviously, a lot of this costs money. It's not simply enough that borrowing costs are low, because the cost of debt isn't just the cost of borrowing, it's the cost of the actual spending that you're doing as well. But the cost of not doing things, the cost of having to lock down is vastly greater. The cost of COVID to the UK economy, not of COVID measures, but of COVID itself to the UK economy, is something like £20 billion a month. It's absolutely eye-watering and astonishing. And I think it's very, very concerning. And I'm deeply worried that there's a kind of sort of primitive, naive fiscalism at the Treasury, where people are worried about the kind of pennies and pence when it comes to government spending, but completely miss the bigger picture about COVID's impact and lockdown's impact on the wider economy, even if indeed after all these failures, lockdown does become necessary. And so I've talked for long enough. My aim is really to make us realize that I don't think this necessarily was inevitable, or at least I don't think that it was inevitable for this to have happened as early as it did. And I'm really shocked by the errors the government made of commission and of omission, by things it didn't do that it should have done. Thanks.
Thanks, Sam. We'll come back to a lot of what you were discussing, a lot of the sort of externalities of whether there's a cost involved in inaction and action, and maybe some of the things that we're focusing on COVID right now, but the things that we're not focusing on as well, and how much they're impacting the rest of the economy and people's livelihoods and lives. But before we do that, I just wanted to have a chat with Alex. Because Alex, you've been doing a series of the economics of COVID, and you did a really lovely video that I watched last week on flu vaccinations and the positive externality and the way in which people are assessing different things on different time periods, and also like whether it's a personal benefit or a social benefit and the personal cost. And I was wondering, what are the sort of biggest ones that you've noticed throughout this pandemic that, personal fronts not taking into account societal benefit, market failure in terms of people's response to this, and also more generally, how you've seen America acting differently from the rest of the world and whether you think that's been a success or a failure.
Yeah, so one way of thinking about this is that the COVID externalities may be the biggest externality in the history of the world. Perhaps only climate change might compete with that. And you can really see this in market prices. Every time, for example, there's a little bit of good vaccine news, the entire stock market jumps up. And what that is telling you is that the vaccine manufacturers are not capturing all of the potential gains to the economy from producing a vaccine. And what that tells you is that we ought to be investing a huge amount in something like producing capacity for these manufacturers of vaccine, or for the therapeutics, for monoclonal antibodies, for example, which appear to be effective. So I agree entirely with what Sam had said about the governments, both the British government and the US government are, penny wise and pound foolish. And it's been astounding to me that there is discussion about, well, should we be spending this and how much about this and how much about this, when meanwhile the US economy is losing trillions of dollars. Larry Summers calculates that the US economy is going to lose about $16 trillion. That's just the US economy. For the world economy, of course, it's even bigger. And you would think that in one sense, this is a benefit in that we're losing so much, we ought to be willing to spend a huge amount to combat COVID. And yet, for reasons which are baffling to me, we appear to be reluctant to or complacent about fighting this. I mean, we're in a war. We're in a war with this virus. When the United States was attacked with 9/11, and 3,000 people, just a little bit over 3,000 people, lost their lives, the whole country was galvanized into fighting multiple wars. Some of that was probably a mistake, obviously, but in any case, the whole country was galvanized into spending trillions of dollars and fighting multiple wars to combat this attack on us. And yet, when many, many more people, 100 times as many people now have died from COVID as died from 9/11. And we're much more reluctant to combat this disease with everything we have, technologically, financially, and so forth. So we should be investing much more in not simply getting a vaccine to market. We're doing pretty good on that on the research and development front. But once a vaccine has been approved, we need for it to be produced in billions of doses. I mean, for the entire world, we're going to want for a vaccine something on the order of 12 billion doses. And in order to do that, you've got to start building the factories to produce those doses now, because the companies, ideally for the companies, if they want to maximize profit, their incentives are actually to go slower than we would like. I mean, they like to sell at a high price early on, right? And then lower the price over time to increase the size of the market, in just the same way that firms will sell a hardback, right, at a very high price, okay? And then they lower the price over time, the paperback, and then it goes to remainder and so forth, right? So that's ideally the firms, from a profit maximizing point of view, want to kind of slow things down and distribute the vaccine over time. And the companies would much rather produce 100 million doses over 3 years than produce 100 million doses, over 3 months, right? But what we want as a society is to produce that 100 million doses within 3 months. So we have to make some investments to say, hey, listen, we're going to pay to double your factory size. You know, you see this line here, we want you to produce another one just like that, right? And this is work which Michael Kramer, Nobel Prize winner, Susan Athey, Chris Snyder, and I, along with a group of economists at Accelerating Health Technologies, while we have been pushing governments, the UK government, the American government, COVAX, Gavi, World Bank, to invest in producing more capacity for vaccines. And the amazing thing is, as I said, is that we can do that. We can save lives and we can save money at the same time, right? If we have some courage about moving forward and taking decisive action, we can actually have the best of both worlds in that we will save lives, we will reduce the risk, get the economy moving again. And many of these investments will be self-financing precisely because the cost of the social distancing is so large, trillions of dollars, that anything we do to fight it, almost anything we do to fight it, is going to have big payoffs. So my major message is to think about this like a war and attack it like a war. And it's amazing to me that we're still not, that message still has not penetrated into the ranks of government.
I find it really interesting as an analogy, that the idea of the war, especially sort of the way in which various countries, the responses have been primarily national. And so you've seen, like, in the same way, war mobilizations happen at a national scale and they invoke large scale nationalist imagery. Here in the UK, that's the NHS, whether you know, elsewhere in the world, it's German engineering and pharmaceutical sector. It is. And it's very interesting in the way you're doing the analogy. I do wonder, though, it's one of those questions that comes up, and I'm going to be a little bit antagonistic. And again, guys, if you have any questions, please do send them in by the Q&A. It's not quite like a war because of the way in which this disease, who this disease is affecting, the age groups involved, and the risk likelihoods. And I was wondering, both Alex and Sam, whether this disease is, whether it merits the attention that it's getting in terms of just the amount of spending, effort, justification, disruption that it's having, and whether you're able to convince people of your belief, and I believe I share as well, that it is worth tackling and spending the money on. Alex, do you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, to me, this is just obvious that it is worthwhile doing. Look, people are valuable. This is, you know, to use a crude economic term, this is human capital, and people are worth a lot. And we should be willing to spend to save lives. And really, there's, look, even if the government did nothing, if there were no lockdowns, okay, no government policy whatsoever, there would still be a tremendous hit to the economy, because people entirely on their own want to stay home. People don't want to go to bars and restaurants in the same numbers that they did before COVID. Okay, so there's going to be a hit to the economy regardless of government policy. It's really COVID which is causing the economic losses rather than, you know, the lockdowns per se. So the focus ought to be on combating COVID. And I mentioned therapeutics and vaccines. I should also mention testing. You know, we could have approved, you know, the FDA in the United States has been incredibly slow, even slower than I would have thought. And I've always been somewhat of a critic of the FDA, but they still have not approved, for example, rapid antigen tests, which are these home pregnancy style kind of tests that you could take very cheap on a strip of paper, which would indicate whether you're infectious or not. Okay, and rapidly scaling out those tests in the entire population could make a huge difference in allowing people to self-isolate when they become infectious and driving cases down to zero. Like, we know this can be done. This is not impossible. So Croatia just tested pretty much everybody in their entire population, right? If Croatia could do it, then certainly the UK and the United States can do it. In China, they tested an entire city of 10 million people over a week. So and China is back up and running, right? So China now has very, very few cases. South Korea has very few cases. Australia has very few cases. So this is possible. And it's possible for us to get control of this, but we have to take decisive action and not this complacency and trying to impose lockdowns too late, really, right? By the time if you only impose the lockdown after you see cases, start to shoot up, then you're acting too slowly. And you would have thought that by now, the government would have understood that you have to get ahead of the virus in order to beat the virus. But we are still trailing the virus every time and then asking, well, why isn't testing working? Okay, well, it's not working because you need to have more tests than cases. You need to overwhelm the system with tests in order to push the number of cases down. And we're still not doing that.
And Sam, I mean, the difference between a quality adjusted life year for someone in their 20s who is hit by a cancer that's no longer being treated, or other diseases that are no longer being treated because of COVID, versus the average age of death at someone in their 80s. Is this a proportionate response? And also, like, just following on from Alex there, why is it that we are still lagging this virus so stunningly? Is it just the nature of this virus, the pre-symptomatic period, the difference, but like who's getting like ill, and is it then feeding through into vulnerable groups? Like, what is the lag here?
Well, there are so many things that I want to say. I'm definitely not going to be able to answer fully. Just one point on the cancer treatment. There are a lot of misunderstandings about what's going on here. I'm not suggesting you misunderstand them. Partly it's that when we have people who are about to die of COVID, if they don't get a ventilator, if they don't get medical attention, it isn't a policy decision to say we're not going to treat these patients in order to treat these patients. It's a triage decision. Now, I don't know that I'm certain that many health services have, under pressure, made the wrong decisions. There was a really horrifying story in the Times recently that suggested that hospitals, the NHS had decided to take kind of precautionary measures to not, advanced triage, to not allow certain cancer patients in, and basically misunderstanding the kind of task that they had. Those are all things that are really, really bad, and I really hope we can figure out what's going on. But fundamentally, the problem is hundreds of thousands of people are getting a disease that could kill them, and hospitals are going to be filled up, have been filled up, and have been. I mean, the Belgian health service is about to collapse. It's really important that people remember that even though the average age of death is very high for COVID, the tails are very fat. So the reason that the average age of death for COVID is very high, it's around 80, I think, is because it's absolutely lethal if you get COVID, if you're over the age of 75. You're probably better off being hit by a car than you are to get COVID if you're over 75. But that doesn't mean that COVID is not a problem for people who are younger. It just means that it's less of a problem. For the 40 to 65 age group, COVID kills 1 in 200 people who get it. Now, I am very, very much against the kind of so-called Great Barrington approach, which sort of says, let's hide away all the people above the age of, say, 65 who are at risk. Let's give everybody else in the population COVID, and then they think we'll have herd immunity. Now, I think there are loads of problems with that. One being that there are 16 million people, and keeping them all in complete isolation is not going to work. The second being that lots of people will still die. Hundreds of thousands of people would still die, even if we said that only people under the age of 65 would be exposed to it. We're not talking about old people. We're not talking about grandparents. We're talking about people pretty much in the prime of their lives, in their 40s and their 50s, who have possibly young kids that they're still looking after. Hundreds of thousands of those people would die under the Great Barrington Declaration approach. And that's if it's working as they intend for it to work. That's assuming that it doesn't somehow actually get into old folks' homes and things like that, and to the old folks who are isolating. And then the final point to make is that nobody wants to get COVID. The reason that Sweden, for example, saw mobility and kind of people's use of public transport and people's use of offices and things like that drop off a cliff at the same time as London in the spring isn't that the Swedish government kind of told them to stay at home, because it didn't. It's that people don't want to get COVID, whether the government tells them they should get COVID or they should expose themselves to it or not. So people will stay at home. People have been staying at home. People rationally, completely rationally and completely reasonably don't want to get this disease. So even if we decided that this approach would be a good one, and I think that you'd have to be crazy to think it would be a good one, but even if you thought that it was a good approach, it would require you either to force people to get COVID who don't want to get COVID, or it would require you to persist with the worst possible kind of lockdown, where we have no control over the virus, where it's continuing to spread, but where we have almost as much of an economic hit as we're getting under the kind of centrally directed lockdown that we have.
That central direction is something that I find really interesting, because a lot of what we would describe as maybe sort of our way of life, people having control over their own lives, the ability to invest, the ability of the market to respond, billions of people's individual decisions, actually having real market power and market share. We're left with, especially in the UK, 4 men really in charge of the lives of millions of people. What's allowed to be open, who's allowed to go where, when they're allowed to see. Is this causing a friction in terms of people's acceptance of what's being done, and how much is being lost at the margins, and like how are we capturing the whole gambit of humanity here at a time when we really need to be doing so? Sam.
Well, I think that one of the problems is that people rationally realize that this is what economists call a collective action problem. It's not just a question of externalities, it's a question of collective action. A few people breaking the rules can impose huge costs to everybody, much more completely out of line with what you would expect in a kind of normal situation, even something like climate change, where, if I pollute, if I create, a ton more of carbon, the amount of damage I'm doing to the world is pretty linear. It's pretty straightforward. With COVID, it's different. If only a few people don't stick to the rules, or if only a few people choose to engage in very high-risk activities, then everybody could get COVID. Because as we saw in the summer, all it takes, it's like a kind of a match. All it takes is a few people to do this, to kind of get the initial cases and to begin them growing, and then really everybody's at risk. I think that a very poor enforcement of the rules has been a problem. Now, I say this as I'm sure a lot of people listening won't think I sound very liberal, and I disagree, because liberalism, in my mind, is the freedom to do whatever you want, provided it doesn't interfere with somebody else's freedom to do what they want. And as Alex said at the beginning, COVID is possibly the biggest externality we've ever seen in the world. Almost everything that you do at the moment, very unusually, does affect almost everybody else's freedom, and it's that kind of the fact that even a few people kind of acting in a kind of basically a way against the rules can impose massive costs on everybody else. So I think it's unavoidable that we need to make decisions from the center. It's unavoidable that we need to make collective decisions here. This isn't something where individual choice really works. Because the biggest determinant of whether you get COVID isn't what you do personally, it's what the people next door to you do.
I think, Alex, we've seen that collective action problem on a much larger scale in the United States in the first wave than we did in Europe and a lot of other parts of the English-speaking world, namely obviously the ones like New Zealand and Australia, which have taken a much harsher approach to seeing a zero spread rather than a low spread route. Is that down to the sort of governance, institutions, state capacity of the United States and its various states, or and the Constitution, or is there something else? Is there something that we've missed, do you think?
Yeah, so I think it's a combination of things. Early on, the CDC, whose entire reason for existing is to combat pandemics, and the CDC utterly failed early on. They produced a test which didn't work, and then in combination with the FDA, they said that we're not going to allow private firms to use their own tests as well. I mean, amazingly, in ordinary times, private firms are allowed to develop their own tests. But an emergency was declared, and during an emergency, it turns out that they need now permission. They have to apply for an emergency use authorization to do something which they could have done without permission before the emergency. So we entirely had the logic reversed, right? That in times of emergency is precisely when you should allow less regulation and more freedom to act quickly. Now, those failures, I think, cannot be blamed on the Trump administration in particular, but the Trump administration then has been utterly incompetent in doing almost anything. Trump got this idea early on in his head that more tests means more cases, and cases look bad for me, therefore I'm going to push back on tests. When in fact, there's a Laffer curve for tests, right? More cases, more tests means more cases at the beginning. But if you have lots and lots of tests, then you can get a hold of the virus. Okay, you can keep people at home. You can start to suppress it. People begin to self-isolate. When you test, you identify, you figure out what's going on. Where are the hotspots? So testing actually reduces the number of cases. And unfortunately, Trump never understood, the latter half of the Laffer curve, if I can use some economic terminology. So some of it is due to a complacency in the United States. Some of it is due to a particular incompetency of the Trump administration. And we'll see, unfortunately, we're not, even with a new administration, we're not going to see any changes, until January, right? The new administration, if there is one, we'll know. Well, we're not going to know today, but people are voting on it today. The new administration doesn't take over until January, so it's going to be time before we see any changes in policy. The only bright light in the Trump administration's approach to COVID was Operation Warp Speed. And this, I think they did have the right idea to fund vaccine manufacturers early. And I think that's what we should be talking about now, is that within the next few weeks, we are likely to have enough information from the clinical trials, which are going on right now, to justify an emergency use authorization. And I think we should have that. I know the British are also reviewing the AstraZeneca trial even as we speak. The US FDA should be doing exactly the same. So we should be looking for an emergency use authorization for vaccines to be given to healthcare workers and first responders in the next few weeks. So that's, I think, where the situation where we are at right now.
One of the complaints that we've seen here in the UK is the same as the FDA and the CDC in the United States, an overly centralized, invented here approach, which is a commonality, especially in the way that which, again, like you said, mobilizing war, it's very sort of national based, and lots of that involves not learning best practice from other countries as they're doing it. But the actual response that you guys seem to want is also a very centralized fiscal response, which means that people, if they need to isolate, do have the funding to do so. Is there a mismatch between wanting on the one hand an overly centralized single approach from a fiscal point of view, but wanting less and less of it from a regulatory point of view on the public health side to try and combat this?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right, but I don't think it's necessarily a contradiction. I mean, the South Korean government did exactly the opposite approach to the United States. So what the South Korean government did very early on is they brought in all of the companies which were capable of producing a test for COVID, and they said, go guys, go, okay? You start working on this, we'll approve it. You start working on this stuff right away. We want tests, and we're going to worry about the regulations later. So in the United States, they said to the testing companies, stop. stop. You cannot do anything before you get regulatory approval. In South Korea, they said, go. Do things before you get regulatory approval. We'll approve it later. So the South Korean approach was a sort of American approach, which has been the odd decentralized approach. The Germans were exactly the same. So the Germans had a decentralized approach to developing tests, and that enabled them to get hold of this disease early on, to get ahead of it much earlier on. Now, in terms of centralization, yeah, of course. When it comes to spending, you're going to have to look to a central government because they're able to borrow. And this is a paradigmatic case of a time when you should be willing to borrow. Again, it is like a war, right? You should be willing to borrow in a war in order to win. And that's what we need to do right now.
And Sam, you have had quite a famous little schism online with Chris Snowden, another senior fellow of the ASI and an employee of our friends on the road at the Institute of Economic Affairs. I think a lot of what the argument that you necessarily have been having with him starts from separate premises about the moral value of freedoms per se versus the public health, economic, like the costs of not imposing various actions or restrictions right now. But Eamon Butler asks us about, like, do you really think that we can defeat this virus by removing people's freedoms? And how astonished are you at how far and fast supposedly liberal democracies have removed people's freedoms? And again, he asked this question: is there an even larger than COVID issue about preserving rights and freedoms? That I think comes down to that schism that you've had with Chris over recent weeks. And does that have a weight in your head?
I think that we have to include the freedom to leave your house without worrying that somebody's going to kill you accidentally, as how we understand freedom. I understand that, you know, we could define freedom as, you know, violence against a person, which I would include through negligence, giving somebody a disease that might kill them personally. But, you know, I don't think that we should just understand freedom as what the government tells us we can and can't do. Many of the most important kinds of freedom are freedom from harm from other people, not just from the state. And it's a kind of a caricature of libertarianism to think that it's just about the state. You know, if freedom means anything, I think if it's a valuable thing, then it should include the freedom to act without the fear that somebody else is going to ruin or potentially end your life through their negligence. You can use different words for that. You know, what I'm saying kind of turns into welfare at some point, and ultimately I do prefer to think about welfare. I just think freedom is a great way of getting to that. I ultimately, though, think that this isn't a decision that we can make. You know, there isn't actually a choice. It's a false idea to think that the choice is either a sort of free choice where we all get to decide what we do versus this sort of heavy-handed state approach. I think it's more like, do we decide that 16 million people, you know, these are people over the age of 65 and people who have pre-existing conditions, which, by the way, does not mean that they're about to die. It just means that they're more likely to die if they get COVID. Do we think that their freedom to leave the house, to go to a shop without fear of death until sometime in the spring or in the summer next year when we get a vaccine matters? I think that it doesn't matter a great deal. And do we think their freedom to not constantly live in fear and potentially the reality of dying because whatever care person has been nominated to bring them food every day either forgets to do that or brings them COVID? That matters a great deal to me. And to go back to my opening remarks, I think it's a false choice. As Alex has said, there are countries that have managed to properly get COVID under control. I don't think we've even tried in the UK. I don't think we've done the bare minimum, and I think we've done lots and lots of things that were obvious at the time were going to make things worse. Foreign holidays would just, I mean, it's whoever made that decision ultimately has a lot resting on their shoulders, and I think has been indirectly responsible for a lot of death and a lot of damage. But there are so many other things as well. So to me, the question isn't, you know, do we let it rip or do we not let it rip? It's what's the zone in the middle? What does the zone in the middle look like, where we can all have as much freedom as possible under the reality that this is a deadly pandemic infectious disease that will affect everybody's lives and will end many people's lives if we don't act realistically about it.
If people
Alex,
are,
one of the best
Yes,
things I get about the Marginal Revolution blog is the fact that you have links from around the world with updates from, from like something interesting from Sweden, something interesting from the UK. It's very much a let's learn the best from everywhere. Linda asks us whether the pandemic and the pandemic response on national levels is another case of the failure of international cooperation and action on a global problem when we all face a similar threat. And we're trying to come up with different approaches. And how do we solve that?
sure. So let me say two things. First of all, on the freedom issue, look, I'm a libertarian. I'm totally for freedom. Okay, and if what people should be thinking about now is the freedom to take a vaccine. Okay, that should be the most pressing concern. Anyone who values freedom should say, listen, I want the choice to take a vaccine even before it has gone through all the FDA approved trials or all the EMU approved trials. That's a freedom which really matters right now. And if you are a healthcare worker or you are somebody, an elderly person in a nursing home at high risk, you should be out protesting your freedom to take a vaccine. Okay, that is a huge freedom, but somehow people don't think about that. They're not protesting that. They're protesting wearing a stupid mask. Okay, and wearing a mask is not a big deal. If you really care about freedom, demand the freedom for medical self-defense. Right? This is what I call medical self-defense. You have a right to self-defense. Well, you ought to have a right to medical self-defense. And that may mean taking a vaccine or early, deciding that the risks of a not yet approved vaccine are outweighed by the risks of COVID. That's the type of freedom which I think is important. Now, on this question, yeah, I mean, it's amazing in the United States how little we are talking about South Korea or Thailand or Singapore, countries which have managed to take control of the virus. Those are just like off the radar, so people will say, well, Australia, it's an island. New Zealand is an island, whatever, South Korea is not an island. Okay. And they were able to get control of the virus. China is not an island. Okay. And they're able to get control of the virus. And I think in one way, I mean, I hope some good will come out of this, and that we ought to feel ashamed, or we ought to feel this is like our Sputnik moment, right? What did Sputnik, when the Russians put Sputnik into outer space, the United States, the US elites said, oh my God, we're behind. We thought we were the greatest country in the world. We thought we were the most technologically advanced country in the world. And here Russia has put us to shame by getting a satellite into orbit before we did. And we ought to be having a same Sputnik moment over our response to COVID. How is it that other countries, which are oftentimes much poorer than us, which have much less state capacity, at least on paper, than the UK or the United States, how is it that these other countries have far outperformed the United States? People in the United States, they ought to be ashamed, and they ought to be looking to other countries to say, why the hell aren't we doing as well as they're doing? Okay, they ought to be turning to their government and demanding a more competent, more qualified response. Because if South Korea can do it, if Thailand can do it, if Singapore can do it, then the United States ought to be able to do it as well, and so should the UK.
If I could just jump in as well, just to add one thing, I totally agree with everything Alex has said. And the masks point just reminded me of the amount of knuckle dragging, basic kind of myopic libertarianism, and I use the word libertarianism under advisement, over the summer, when masks were brought in for the first time, when it became obvious that droplets and aerosols were how this disease is mostly spread, the number of people who objected on supposedly libertarian grounds to people being required to wear masks is just staggering. Those people are responsible for us going into second lockdown. Those people who claim to be on the side of freedom are the people who are responsible for the most constraining measures that we're bringing in, because they didn't think about the consequences of their actions, and they didn't think beyond, oh, well, I personally am not at risk. Well, that means that that's fine. I can make decisions for myself. And it's that caricature of libertarianism that I'm afraid some libertarians hold to themselves, but I hope and I believe that most libertarians do not. Most libertarians realize that it isn't about atomism, and your actions do affect other people, and that's really important. But it's that caricature of libertarianism that I think has had some small part in getting us to where we are, and that's really, really depressing to me.
Peter asks something that I think I've seen multiple times, that is sort of what's the exit strategy from lockdowns, furloughs, tier 2, near lockdowns, the different responses we're seeing in America and the UK. And I just want to caveat it by also asking, like, again, I see this, like, what is the purpose of the lockdown? Is it just a postponement? Is it to reduce spread to nothing? Is it to get us to the point where there is a vaccine? And therefore, and also maybe new treatments, and what's the cost of that you're willing to bear, and for how long?
Yeah, let me address that a little bit. Yeah, I mean, I think this is exactly the right question, right? And I think a lockdown, I don't want to. I think taking actions now, whether you want to call it a lockdown or whatever you want to call it, this is even a better time than at the beginning, because now we do have a therapeutic, monoclonal antibodies, which appear to be working very well. We need to produce much, much more of them, okay? And a vaccine is close. It's not years away, it's months away. It may even be weeks away. So protecting ourselves now for a limited amount of time until we get to a vaccine, until we are able to produce more therapeutics, actually makes a lot of sense. Makes a lot of sense, because it will be very temporary. Okay. There are more than 24, or about 20, 25 vaccines in clinical trials right now. There are 3 or 4 which in the next several weeks we'll have enough data to justify an emergency use authorization, or I'm sure there's a similar in the UK. So that really is a limited. There really there really is hope at the end of the tunnel. Okay, we really have made progress, and if we can save a lot of lives right now in order to get us into the vaccine time.
And how long would you be willing to go, this isn't happening, before you change your mind on that?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it depends what exactly you mean by lockdown. So, personally, I think there's a good argument for getting the schools, and I think we can do a lot of what we want to do, okay, if we again take this problem seriously. Like, there's no reason why every school child cannot be tested several times a week, okay, with a rapid antigen test, even daily, right? So if we get our act together, we can reopen the schools, okay, and a lot of workplaces, okay, with rapid antigen tests. So we don't have to lock down all that much. What we're really talking about is preventing super spreading events. So really that's indoor bars, indoor restaurants, and, concerts, large, places where there's a big crowd, places where there's singing, shouting, okay? There's actually not that much that, quote, we need to lock down, right? We need to prevent super spreader events. We need to get the number of cases down enough so that then we can quickly move in with testing and tracing, right? Like, testing and tracing doesn't work when your cases are exploding. It's because the virus is ahead of you. But if you get the numbers down, then testing and tracing can work. So we can do everything that we need to do without having massive lockdowns if we're willing to take some decisive actions.
Sam, how long are you willing to? I mean, a lot of the things that Alex just mentioned there, whether it's bars, and restaurants, clubs, where people meet and socialize, are things that many people think of as making life worth living. How long are you willing to force people to not enjoy the joys of life before you change your mind on whether the cost was worth it?
I think it's kind of a moot question. That kind of question is the sort of thing that I think it was reasonable to ask in March. But I've just seen today the government in the UK has issued a directive to GPs to get ready to issue the first vaccines at the beginning of December. That's pretty promising, and I think to still be asking, oh well, what if there's never a vaccine, is a little bit kind of. Are you not? And again, not directing this at you, but many people who do ask this question, you kind of wonder. I mean, are you following this? Are you following the kind of basic developments in this? But to me, I mean, to answer, to not evade a question or to not avoid a question, the second best approach to suppression and the vaccine, or maybe even the first best approach that we didn't try, would be elimination. I think it's impossible to say that we should just let the vaccine rip indefinitely, because just as easily as somebody could ask, well, what if we don't get a vaccine? I can ask, well, what if immunity doesn't last for longer than 4 months? What are you willing to do in that case? And if immunity only lasts 4 or 5 months, and you're saying that we should have this virus floating around the world endemic forever, I mean, that seems like a pretty poor option compared to elimination, which is what they've done in New Zealand, which is what they're close to doing in Australia, and I think would be a much more viable strategy than just saying, well, we're going to just accept that we've knocked 5 years off the country's lifespan because we couldn't get our act together to wipe this disease out. But fortunately, we're not in that world. We're in a world where human ingenuity, when it really wants something, can actually get it, and I think we're about to get it.
Yeah, I like the idea of the right to try. I think both of you have alluded to it. How do we ensure both that citizens of all the states in the US and also the UK have the right to try vaccines as soon as they're approved or pre-approved?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the public has to demand it. And yeah, I think it's peculiar. You have these foul weather libertarians who suddenly get all upset about masks and never say a word about medical self-defense, or as you put it, the right to try. So I think we are close. I think the data are starting to be developed, and we can, we can combine releasing a vaccine, okay, with further clinical trials. So we're not going to have enough vaccine available immediately to treat everyone on the moment that one is approved. But what we can do is to start distributing it using some randomization. So the first people to go to will probably be healthcare workers and first responders. So you've got a bunch of hospitals, you've got a bunch of police stations, fire stations, nursing homes. What you want to do is to distribute the vaccine randomly, choose hospitals, choose nursing homes, choose police stations randomly, and then follow up. Distribute the vaccine. If you get the right coin flip, you distribute the vaccine to some, but not to others. And then you compare what happens. So even as we're distributing the vaccine, we can continue the clinical trials. In fact, expand the clinical trials to millions of people and even get better information as we go along. So right now, I think it would be justified taking a vaccine if you're in a high risk category. And as we expand these clinical trials while distributing the vaccine, we'll gather more information. We'll see for whom the vaccine works best, for whom it works less well, what the safety issues might be. And then we can decide, should you be taking a vaccine if you're, 25 and not in a high risk category. We're also going to be developing multiple vaccines. So the first ones are not necessarily the best ones, but it may very well be justified, again, if you're a high risk worker interacting a lot with the public, transit worker, for example, it could well be justified to take one of the vaccines early, and then other people can take different vaccines later. But the public has to demand this. And so I hope all of the erstwhile libertarians will now get together and demand that medical self-defense and the right to take a vaccine.
And Sam, how do you ensure the competition that exists between pharmaceutical companies is a positive effect in this kind of a crisis rather than one in which leads to just higher prices for taxpayers trying to get a vaccine, profiteering, or maybe
I'm totally happy with profiteering. Profiteering in a crisis is great. Profiteering increases supply. Profiteering means that in future, the expectation is that if you put the resources kind of in place such that you're ready to profiteer next time there's a crisis, you'll be rewarded. That means that we're going to be better off in the next crisis. So I'm all in favor of profiteering in a crisis. I think it's essential. Actually, now that you mention it, one of the lesser known harms that we've seen in the UK is that the Competition and Markets Authority, the UK Competition Authority, issued a kind of warning to businesses at the beginning of the crisis that they would be investigated for price gouging if they raised prices. And what happened in practice was that, probably for PR reasons rather than for that, most of the national chains did not raise their prices. I think it would have looked very bad for them from a public relations point of view. And the result was, of course, shortages. There were meat shortages, flour shortages, there were shortages of lots of things. Now, luckily, I think everybody was okay. But one reason for that is that local shops, the kind of corner shops that don't have PR concerns, did raise their prices. You know, I paid about 3 times more for a big sack of rice, a 20-kilo sack of jasmine rice from a local Asian supermarket, because I really, really wanted to make sure I had that. And that was fine. I was happy to pay that price. I was happy to, they were profiteering. That's great. And it's actually interesting that it was precisely because of the profit, and this is true for flour as well and other things like that. And it was precisely because of these smaller shops that weren't worried about the PR effects of profiteering, and perhaps weren't worried about the Competition and Markets Authority, that we were able to access these things when need was highest. I think it's a nice little kind of example of not necessarily a government intervention, but certainly a kind of self-imposed constraint leading to some fairly significant harm, I think.
That was a wonderful defense of profiteering. I really, genuinely, that was great. Alex, it would be remiss of me on today of all days to ignore the biggest event that's happening over the pond. Does it have any real impact? Obviously not for the first 2 months until a new administration maybe comes in, or Trump is returned tomorrow or this week. But does the actual response of the administration really matter depending on who's in charge in the White House on this?
Yeah, ordinarily, in almost any other circumstance, I would have said no. But I think that Trump has been sort of uniquely incompetent. Most of the time, GDP continues to rise, and it doesn't really matter which party so much is in power. But character here really has made a difference. And I think going in, my worry about Trump was that in an emergency, he would not be well prepared. And I think I didn't know what the emergency would be. Whether it be a nuclear war or conflagration or something like Katrina or
just
a
the small
pandemic.
things, just the small ones, right?
And it turns out to matter. It turns out leadership does matter, and I think that's actually a problem. It's a problem that so much depends upon one guy, but unfortunately. Unfortunately, this pandemic has shown that, leadership matters, and the states did not step up. We always talk about in the United States, laboratories of democracy, but the states have been, over the past 50 years, have really been neutered. And so they just don't have the will or the capacity to do very much. So just a lot just depends upon the executive. Now, nothing will happen until January. I think the one positive point which may happen is that some people on the Democrat side, the anti-Trump side, have been stoking fears about, quote, a Trump vaccine, right? About this idea that Trump is going to try and do a November surprise and is going to push an unsafe vaccine. And they've been appealing a little bit to the anti-vaxxers and stoking up those fears. And I hope that if Biden is elected, that those pressures will ease off and the Democrats will realize that a vaccine now is in their interests, and we will see less of this fear mongering, and therefore we can all push ahead together on getting a vaccine out as quickly as possible.
Fair enough. And just to finish up, Alex, percentage chance, like who do you think is going to win? What percentage chance are you giving your certainty?
Yeah, I think Biden is going to win. I think it's going to be a bigger win than most people expect, close to a landslide. But look, I could be wrong. I'll stick with, the prediction markets, I think, are still giving Trump, 40%, something like that, 35%. So you got to take that very seriously. But my expectation is that I think it will be a bigger win than most people expect, though we have all been humbled by 2020 in all of our predictions. So I'm not going to put a lot of weight on that.
And Sam, what are you predicting this evening to happen, and what percentage chance are you putting with your confidence?
Well, I usually put my money where my mouth is when it comes to politics. I'm actually stake limited on Betfair, which is a bit embarrassing to admit. But a lot of it's safe bets on kind of vote share in states that are kind of sure things either way. I think it will be Biden. I hope it's a large margin. I hope that perhaps there's been overcorrection for the 2016 surprise in the polls. But who knows? I would say 75% chance of Biden. But I'm a very, very nervous and superstitious person on this particular, when it comes right down to the wire, I'm very superstitious.
Yeah, I think I'm in the same boat. I had very different sort of like levels of confidence about predicting this about a month ago, and I've come down to a very much flipping a coin kind of thing right now. But thank you very much, both of you, for joining us. Thank you, everybody who listened in, and who hopefully you'll join us next week. Thank you again, Alex. Thank you, Sam. Thank you all. Have a good evening.
Thank you.